Hi, I'm Dale Wells. Welcome to Lesson 8 in our Heritage Bible Masterclass study of Moses, Face to Face with God. Today we're talking about sharing the burden of leadership, and we're looking at Numbers chapter 11. The Heritage Bible Masterclass is a non-denominational group of senior adults who love the Lord and His Word. We meet at the Heritage Palms Country Club south of Fred Waring, east of Jefferson Street in Indio, California, every Sunday morning at 10:15. We'd love to have you join us. Just let them know at the gate that you're there for the Bible study, and the guard will let you right in. Our scripture reading today is Numbers chapter 11, verses 4 to 35. Join me as we listen to the reading.
The rabble with them began to crave other food, and again the Israelites started wailing and said, "If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna." The manna was like coriander seed and looked like resin. The people went around gathering it, and then ground it in a hand mill or crushed it in a mortar. They cooked it in a pot or made it into loaves, and it tasted like something made with olive oil. When the dew settled on the camp at night, the manna also came down. Moses heard the people of every family wailing at the entrance to their tents. The Lord became exceedingly angry, and Moses was troubled. He asked the Lord, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms, as a nurse carries an infant, to the land you promised on oath to their ancestors? Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me, 'Give us meat to eat.' I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you're going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me, if I have found favor in your eyes, and do not let me face my own ruin." The Lord said to Moses, "Bring me 70 of Israel's elders, who are known to you as leaders and officials among the people. Have them come to the tent of meeting, that they may stand there with you. I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take some of the power of the Spirit that is on you and put it on them. They will share the burden of the people with you, so that you will not have to carry it alone. Tell the people, 'Consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow, when you will eat meat. The Lord heard you when you wailed, "If only we had meat to eat. We were better off in Egypt." Now the Lord will give you meat, and you will eat it. You will not eat it for just 1 day, or 2 days, or 5, 10, or 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and you loathe it, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wailed before him, saying, 'Why did we ever leave Egypt?'" But Moses said, "Here I am among 600,000 men on foot, and you say, 'I will give them meat to eat for a whole month?' Would they have enough if flocks and herds were slaughtered for them? Would they have enough if all the fish in the sea were caught for them?" The Lord answered Moses, "Is the Lord's arm too short? Now you will see whether or not what I say will come true for you." So Moses went out and told the people what the Lord had said. He brought together 70 of their elders and had them stand around the tent. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and spoke with him, and he took some of the power of the Spirit that was on him and put it on the 70 elders. When the Spirit rested on them, they prophesied, but did not do so again. However, 2 men, whose names were Eldad and Medad, had remained in the camp. They were listed among the elders, but did not go out to the tent. Yet the Spirit also rested on them, and they prophesied in the camp. A young man ran and told Moses, "Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp." Joshua, son of Nun, who had been Moses' aide since youth, spoke up and said, "Moses, my lord, stop them." But Moses replied, "Are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit on them." Then Moses and the elders of Israel returned to the camp. Now a wind went out from the Lord and drove quail in from the sea. It scattered them up to 2 cubits deep all around the camp, as far as a day's walk in any direction. All that day and night, and all the next day, the people went out and gathered quail. No one gathered less than 10 homers. Then they spread them out all around the camp. But while the meat was still between their teeth, and before it could be consumed, the anger of the Lord burned against the people, and he struck them with a severe plague. Therefore the place was named Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had craved other food. From Kibroth Hattaavah the people traveled to Hazeroth and stayed there.
I've come up with 10 questions in our study guide on this text. Here are the questions and the way I answered them. What complaint did the Israelites bring against the Lord? Verses 4 to 6 tells us the complaint. The rabble with them began to crave other food, and again the Israelites started wailing and said, "If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we've lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna." Now, notice that the Israelites' complaint centered on their dissatisfaction with the manna and the nostalgic looking back to the varied foods that they had enjoyed in Egypt. But notice this, the complaint began with this group called the rabble. That's a term that's used to describe the mixed multitude of non-Israelites who had joined the Exodus. But the rabble started the complaint, and the Israelites carried it on. That's what verse 4 says. The idea of the specific complaint was, if only we had the kind of food, the kind of variety in our menu that we had back in Egypt. We ate all this food at no cost. But now we just see this manna, and that's all we see, and we're so tired of the monotony. This is really kind of ironic, because it's true their food in Egypt didn't come at a cost in terms of their monetary system, but it came at the cost of their freedom and their dignity as slaves. The Hebrew literally means that we got this food for nothing. We got this food free, revealing how selective memory can distort the reality during times of hardship. The complaint reflects several psychological and spiritual issues. First, it demonstrates the power of nostalgia to romanticize the past suffering when present circumstances become difficult. The Israelites have forgotten the brutality of Egyptian slavery, and all they remembered was the dietary variety. We have the same problem these days when we talk about the good old days. If you really looked at them, they really weren't all that good. Second, it reveals ingratitude for divine provision. The manna was miraculous daily bread from heaven, and yet here they are treating it with contempt. And third, it shows how physical desires can overshadow spiritual blessings and covenant promises. The Hebrew word ta'av is translated craved or lusted in verse 4. It's a word that describes intense selfish desire that goes beyond the legitimate need to encompass ungoverned appetite. The same root appears in the 10th commandment's prohibition against coveting, suggesting that what Israel is doing here is they're violating a fundamental covenant obligation. They are lusting after the food that they had enjoyed in Egypt, and that craving is not just merely hunger for variety, but it's spiritual rebellion against the divine provision and authority that's caring for them in the desert. The geographical context adds significance to their complaint. They're in the wilderness of Paran. This puts them about 1 year into their journey toward the Promised Land. The timing suggests that their initial enthusiasm for freedom and all of the miracles that had accompanied their escape from Egypt has worn off. The daily realities of wilderness travel has created longing for the familiar, even when the familiar had been oppressive. As Gordon Wenham says in his commentary on Numbers, the Israelites' complaint reveals how quickly the human heart can transform miraculous provision into routine disappointment, preferring the familiar misery of the past to the uncertain blessings of divine guidance toward a promised future. Manna was a wafer-like substance, and it was Israel's daily provision in the desert. What different ways did the Israelites find to cook and serve manna? Well, verses 7 and 8 tell us the manna was like coriander seed. It looked like resin. The people went around gathering it and then ground it in a hand mill or crushed it in a mortar. They cooked it in a pot or made it into loaves, and it tasted like something made with olive oil. The text provides detailed description of manna's appearance and the various preparation methods the Israelites developed to create dietary variety from this single food source. This text says that manna was like coriander seed and looked like resin, using two comparison points that suggest both size and appearance. Coriander refers to small round seeds, while resin describes a translucent aromatic gum that would give manna a jewel-like appearance. The preparation methods described in verse 8 reveal considerable culinary creativity. The people went around gathering it, and they ground it in a hand mill or crushed it in a mortar. They cooked it in a pot or made it into loaves. The verbs demonstrate multiple processing techniques: grinding with millstones or hand mills to create a flour-like consistency, while crushing it describes pounding it in mortars to break down the substance. The cooking methods include boiling it in pots, likely creating a porridge or soup-like consistency, and making it into loaves, suggesting they could form manna into bread-like products. The text says it looked like something or tasted like something made with olive oil, indicating that manna had a rich, satisfying flavor despite its simple appearance. The variety of preparation methods demonstrates both human ingenuity and divine provision that allowed creative adaptation. Archaeological evidence from ancient Middle Eastern cultures shows that grinding, crushing, boiling, and baking were the standard food preparation techniques, suggesting that manna could be processed using familiar methods despite its supernatural origin. The daily gathering process required significant labor and coordination. Exodus 16, verses 16 to 18 specifies that each person gathered about an omer, which is about 2 quarts a day, requiring early morning collection before the sun melted the manna. This daily routine created opportunities for community interaction, and it reminded Israel of their dependence upon God's divine provision. However, the text's detailed description of manna preparation appears in the context of Israel's complaint, creating irony between the divine provision of a versatile food and human dissatisfaction with monotony. The elaborate preparation options suggest that boredom with manna reflected spiritual rather than culinary limitations. Jacob Milgrom says this in his JPS Torah commentary. The detailed description of manna's preparation methods reveals both divine generosity in providing adaptable sustenance and human ingratitude in treating miraculous provision as mundane routine rather than daily evidence of divine faithfulness. How is it possible that this miraculous gift was treated with such disdain? Notice what verses 4 to 6 says. The rabble with them began to crave other food, and again the Israelites started wailing and said, "If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we've lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna." You've heard the saying, familiarity breeds contempt, and that's demonstrated. Here, the daily routine of gathering the manna every morning and consuming it every day for about a year has been going on, and what initially appeared miraculous has now become ordinary through repetition, illustrating how human nature adapts to blessings until they seem commonplace rather than extraordinary. The Hebrew concept of being weary with something indicates disgust, born from excessive familiarity rather than inadequate provision. Selective memory played a crucial role in their disdain. The Israelites, in their minds, romanticized the Egyptian food while forgetting the Egyptian oppression, demonstrating how present difficulties can distort historical perspective. When they say, we remember, they're using selective recollection that preserves pleasant memories while suppressing painful ones, creating a false sense of nostalgia that makes the present circumstances seem worse by comparison. They have this cultural dietary expectation that influences their response. Ancient Middle Eastern cuisine featured diverse foods, spices, and preparation methods that created complex flavors and textures. Despite manna's versatility, it represented a dramatic reduction in the culinary variety compared to their previous diet. The specific foods they mentioned, fish, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic, suggest that they're longing for strong flavors and varied textures that manna could not replicate. Spiritual immaturity manifested through their inability to recognize divine grace in unexpected forms. The Israelites expected the divine provision to match their preferences rather than trusting divine wisdom in the form of the provision that's offered. Their complaint reflects the human tendency to evaluate divine gifts according to personal desires rather than divine purposes. The influence of the rabble, verse 4, can easily escape our notice, but it demonstrates how negative attitudes can spread through communities, particularly when they start out being expressed by those without a deep covenant commitment. The mixed multitude who had joined Israel's exodus lacked the theological framework for understanding manna as a divine gift rather than emergency rations, and they influenced the rest of the Israelites to complain. Then there's entitlement mentality, which developed as daily provision became expected rather than received as grace. The transition from gratitude for divine rescue to a demand for divine service illustrates how quickly recipients of grace can become consumers with expectations rather than grateful beneficiaries of undeserved blessings. And finally, there's the physical monotony combined with the spiritual immaturity that created conditions for ingratitude in spite of miraculous provision. The Israelites focused on what they lacked rather than appreciating what they had received, demonstrating how perspective demonstrates response to divine gifts more than the objective value of those gifts themselves. As Timothy Ashley says in his commentary, miraculous gifts can become objects of disdain when familiarity replaces wonder, selective memory distorts gratitude, and human preferences overshadow divine wisdom in the form that grace takes. So God is angry, Moses is troubled. How would you characterize their relationship with each other? The relationship between God and Moses in this passage reveals a profound intimacy characterized by honest communication, mutual respect, and shared burden bearing that distinguishes their interaction from typical divine human encounters. Moses' response to God's divine anger demonstrates a remarkable freedom to express his frustration and even challenge God's actions without fear of rejection or punishment. Notice bold questioning by Moses. He begins with a direct confrontation. Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? That's what he says in verse 11. He uses strong language that borders on accusation, and yet God receives Moses' challenge without a rebuke. This suggests a relationship that's secure enough to accommodate honest emotional expression. Notice how Moses continues his complaint, revealing his deep personal anguish. Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms as a nurse carries an infant to the land you promised on oath to their ancestors? The metaphors he uses, conception and birth and nursing, are intimate family imagery, describing Moses' overwhelming sense of responsibility for these people. Moses' threat to resign represents the ultimate test of their relationship. If this is how you're going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me if I've found favor in your eyes. Do not let me face my own ruin, he says in verse 15. When he says kill me, that's emphatic. He indicates his desperate sincerity. He's not engaged in manipulative dramatics. But notice God's response. It reveals divine patience and understanding rather than anger at Moses' boldness. Instead of punishment for insubordination, God provides practical assistance through the appointment of 70 elders, verses 16 and 17. This response suggests that divine leadership includes the accommodation for human limitation rather than a demand for superhuman capability. I see three key characteristics of the relationship between God and Moses. First, there is emotional transparency. Both parties express authentic feelings without diplomatic filtering. Moses can tell God what he thinks, and God can handle it and deal with Moses' insecurity. Second, it involves mutual problem solving, where divine wisdom addresses human concerns through collaborative solutions. Moses feels overwhelmed. God says, I'll give you 70 men to help you. Third, it maintains respect despite conflict, as God honors Moses' leadership while Moses ultimately submits to God's divine authority. Throughout the book of Numbers, you see this kind of dialogue pattern going on, showing that this communication style between God and Moses is not an isolated incident. Moses regularly brings community concerns to God and he receives divine guidance, while God shares divine intentions and seeks Moses' partnership in implementing them. The relationship also reveals divine condescension as God accommodates Moses' human limitations and his emotional needs rather than demanding perfect compliance with divine will. God's flexibility demonstrates love rather than just authority in their partnership. As Dennis Olson says in his commentary, the relationship between God and Moses demonstrates that authentic spiritual leadership requires not perfect compliance, but honest communication, where divine patience meets human transparency to create partnership in accomplishing divine purposes, despite human limitations. What is Moses upset about? What do you tend to do when you feel overwhelmed or angry? Moses' distress stems from crushing leadership responsibility combined with inadequate resources and unappreciative constituents, creating a perfect storm of an administrative burden, emotional exhaustion, and spiritual crisis. His complaint reveals multiple layers of frustration that transform leadership privilege into overwhelming burden, requiring God's divine intervention. The primary source of Moses' anger involves feeling abandoned by God despite his faithful service. Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? Verse 11. The idea of a burden refers to a heavy load that exceeds his carrying capacity, suggesting that Moses feels assigned an impossible task without adequate divine support. Moses expresses resentment about unwanted responsibility for people he didn't choose. Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Those are rhetorical questions that use family imagery to challenge the divine expectation that he somehow assumed the parental responsibility for Israel without corresponding authority or resources. The verbs conceive and give birth emphasize the absurdity of expecting non-parents to provide total care. Then there's the impossibility of meeting divine and human expectations that creates additional frustration. Where can I get meat to give all these people? They keep wailing to me, give us meat to eat. Verse 13. Moses recognizes that the people's demands exceed his capacity to provide, yet he feels responsible for their satisfaction. The word wailing indicates persistent, loud crying that just wears down his leadership patience. Then there's a sense of isolation that appears in his complaint about bearing this responsibility alone. I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me, he says in verse 14, emphasizing his loneliness in leadership and lack of adequate human support for his overwhelming responsibilities. Then his death wish. That represents the depth of his despair. If this is how you're going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me if I found favor in your eyes. Do not let me face my own ruin. Moses says he would prefer death to continued failure and humiliation. And he doubts divine provision. That emerges in verses 21 and 22. Here I am among 600,000 men on foot, and you say I will give them meat to eat for a whole month. Would they have enough if flocks and herds were slaughtered for them? Would they have enough if all the fish in the sea were caught for them? His mathematical calculation demonstrates human reasoning attempting to solve divine promises through natural resources. When people feel overwhelmed or angry, they typically respond through various coping mechanisms. Some withdraw from responsibilities and relationships, seeking escape from pressure through avoidance or isolation. Others lash out at available targets, displacing their frustration onto family members, colleagues, or subordinates who had nothing to do with the original problem. Many people engage in blame shifting, finding others responsible for their circumstances, rather than accepting personal responsibility or seeking constructive solutions. Some seek sympathy and validation from friends or family, looking for emotional support rather than practical assistance. Constructive responses include things like seeking help from appropriate sources, delegating responsibilities when possible, and developing realistic expectations about personal limitations. And of course, there's prayer and counseling and spiritual direction that provide resources for processing our emotions and finding perspective during overwhelming circumstances. The key principle from Moses' experience involves bringing honest emotions directly to God rather than suppressing them or displacing them onto others, while remaining open to divine solutions that may exceed human expectations or understanding. As Dennis Cole says in his commentary, Moses' honest expression of overwhelming burden demonstrates that effective leadership requires not superhuman strength, but authentic communication with God about human limitations, opening the way for divine provision of resources and support that exceed individual capacity. What conversation did the Lord and Moses have about meat? The conversation between God and Moses about meat reveals divine response to human complaint through both gracious provision and corrective discipline, demonstrating that divine gifts can serve multiple purposes simultaneously. God's promise to provide meat goes far beyond meeting Israel's expressed need to address their deeper spiritual issues through abundance that becomes a burden. Notice God's initial command requires Moses to tell the people, consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow when you will eat meat. The Lord heard you when you wailed, if only we had meat to eat. We were better off in Egypt. Now the Lord will give you meat and you will eat it. When he tells the people to consecrate yourselves, he's talking about the fact that before you can come into God's presence, you have to be spiritually prepared. Spiritual preparation is more than just physical hunger. And he goes on and talks about the duration and extent of the promised provision. You will not eat it for just 1 day or 2 days or 5, 10, or 20 days, but for a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils and you loathe it. There's a vivid imagery there. How excess leads to revulsion rather than satisfaction. They're going to become as disgusted with the meat as they now are with the manna. And the reason for this overwhelming provision addresses Israel's fundamental spiritual problem. Because you have rejected the Lord who is among you and have wailed before him, saying, "Why did we ever leave Egypt?" You've rejected God. That indicates their complaint about food represents a deeper rebellion against God's authority and providence. Moses' response reveals his struggle with divine promises that exceed natural possibility. Moses said, "Here I am among 600,000 men on foot, and you say I will give them meat to eat for a whole month?" His mathematical calculation attempts to solve the divine promise through human logic, demonstrating the common human tendency to limit God's divine power according to natural resources and human capability. Moses continues his logical objection. Would they have enough if flocks and herds were slaughtered for them? Would they have enough if all the fish in the sea were caught for them? These rhetorical questions assume that divine provision has to operate through conventional means, revealing that Moses has at least temporarily lost his faith in supernatural divine power, in spite of his previous experience with miraculous provision. And the Lord answers Moses' challenge that comes out of his limited perspective. Is the Lord's arm too short? Now you will see whether or not what I say will come true for you. The phrase, "the hand of the Lord is shortened," uses anthropomorphic language to ask whether divine power has limitations, while the challenge, "you will see," promises empirical evidence of God's divine capability. The conversation reveals several theological principles. First, divine provision often exceeds human requests to demonstrate divine generosity and power. Second, divine gifts can serve corrective as well as blessing purposes when human attitudes require adjustment. And third, divine promises often challenge human logic and require faith rather than understanding for acceptance. The irony emerges in God providing exactly what Israel requested in ways they didn't expect or want, demonstrating the danger of demanding divine compliance with human desires rather than trusting divine wisdom in timing and method of provision. Jacob Milgram says, "The conversation about meat reveals that divine provision can simultaneously demonstrate divine generosity and divine judgment, giving people exactly what they demand in ways that expose the folly of their desires and the wisdom of divine alternatives." Why do you think God responds to the Israelites with anger, but to Moses with help and understanding? God's response to the Israelites via Moses shows that God distinguishes between rebellious complaint and faithful leadership crisis. Divine reactions depend upon the heart attitude and spiritual condition of those involved rather than merely the surface expressions of distress. The Israelites' complaint represents spiritual rebellion against divine authority and provision. Their longing for Egypt constitutes rejection of divine deliverance and their covenant relationship in favor of familiar bondage. When the text says they craved these things, it indicates a selfish desire that goes beyond legitimate need to encompass ungoverned appetite that violates covenant faithfulness. Their complaint fundamentally challenges God's divine wisdom and goodness rather than seeking God's help for their legitimate concerns. Moses' distress, by contrast, emerges from faithful service that has reached human limitations. His burden bearing for Israel represents covenant loyalty rather than rebellion, and his honest expression of overwhelming responsibility demonstrates authentic relationship with God rather than rejection of divine authority. The theological principle involves divine response to the heart attitude behind the expressed concerns. The Israelites' complaint stems from ingratitude, nostalgia for bondage, and rejection of divine provision, while Moses' complaint stems from faithful service that requires divine assistance to continue effectively. God responds to spiritual rebellion with corrective discipline, but to faithful leadership crisis with supportive provision. As Dennis Olson says, divine responses to human complaints depend not on the expressed distress, but on the heart attitude behind it. Faithful servants, overwhelmed by responsibility, receive supportive assistance, while rebellious complainers receive corrective discipline, both expressions of divine love appropriate to different spiritual conditions. How does God deal with the people's complaints? Well, God's response to Israel's complaints demonstrates divine justice that provides exactly what they demanded, while simultaneously correcting their ungrateful hearts through abundance that becomes burden rather than blessing. God's strategy reveals both generosity and discipline operating together to address both surface requests and underlying spiritual issues. The initial divine promise provides overwhelming abundance. Now the Lord will give you meat and you will eat it. You will not eat it for just 1 day or 2 days or 5, 10, or 20 days, but for a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils and you loathe it. When it says you'll eat it until it comes out of your nostrils, that creates a graphic imagery of satiation that becomes revulsion. The miraculous provision of quail exceeds all natural expectations. Verse 31 says, "Now a wind went out from the Lord and drove quail in from the sea. It scattered them up to 2 cubits deep all around the camp, as far as a day's walk in any direction." So divine agency brings the natural phenomena in an unnatural way. This measurement, these quail are 2 cubits deep. That's about 3 feet deep, suggesting unprecedented abundance that transforms the landscape. And the people's response to it reveals insatiable greed rather than grateful satisfaction. All that day and night and all the next day, the people went out and gathered quail. No one gathered less than 10 homers, and they spread them out all around the camp. Now you read that and you wonder, how much is 10 homers? Well, that's about 60 bushels per person, indicating that the people are engaged in hoarding behavior that goes far beyond reasonable consumption needs. Divine judgment comes through the very provision they demanded. Verse 33 says, "While the meat was still between their teeth and before it could be consumed, the anger of the Lord burned against the people, and he struck them with a severe plague." The idea is that while they're in the middle of enjoying the desired provision, God brings judgment on them. And their graves become a memorial to God's discipline. Notice the name. The place was named Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had craved. Literally, the Hebrew Kibroth Hattaavah means graves of craving, and it preserves the lesson about the deadly consequences of ungoverned appetite and rebellion against God's provision. There are some theological principles here. First, divine justice sometimes provides exactly what people demand, to expose the folly of their desires rather than denying the requests outright. Second, abundance without gratitude becomes a burden rather than a blessing, revealing that satisfaction depends upon the heart attitude rather than the material quantity. Third, divine provision can serve corrective purposes simultaneously with meeting expressed needs, demonstrating that God's responses often address deeper spiritual issues through surface circumstances. And fourth, the consequences of rebellious craving serve as a warning to future generations about the importance of gratitude and contentment with divine provision. As Timothy Ashley says, God's provision of overwhelming abundance that becomes a burden rather than a blessing demonstrates that divine justice sometimes gives rebellious people exactly what they demand to expose the deadly consequences of ungrateful craving and rejection of divine wisdom. Power is a privilege, but it's also a burden not easily or willingly shared. What can we learn from Moses' response to God empowering the 70 elders? Verse 28 tells us that Moses' aide-de-camp, Joshua, recoiled at the idea of these 70 men, these upstarts, now prophesying and speaking for God. Moses' response was this: "Are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets and that the Lord would put his spirit on them." His response to the divine empowerment of the 70 elders reveals mature spiritual leadership characterized by generous sharing of authority, joy in other people's success, and understanding that divine work benefits from distributed rather than concentrated power. His reaction stands in stark contrast to typical human responses to shared authority, and it provides some principles for healthy leadership development. Moses doesn't resist or express concern about his diminished personal authority. He is so happy about sharing the leadership. His validation of the elders' divine calling through prophecy creates an immediate confirmation of their empowerment. Verse 25 says, "When the Spirit rested on them, they prophesied, but did not do so again," indicating that God is now working through them. Even when Eldad and Medad prophesy in the camp rather than in the tent, and Joshua comes and says, "Make them stop," Moses is so happy that God has spread the blessing out to all of these men that he tells Joshua, "Let it go. If you're jealous for my sake, I appreciate that, but I wish the Lord would put his spirit on everyone." This gives us some crucial leadership principles. First, secure leaders celebrate other people's successes rather than feeling threatened by shared authority. Moses recognizes that divine work benefits from multiplication of gifted leaders rather than concentration in one person. And second, mature leaders understand that empowering others enhances rather than diminishes their own effectiveness and legacy. So Moses' genuine enthusiasm for this widespread spiritual empowerment is a great lesson for today's leaders. Contemporary leaders can learn some lessons from Moses' example here. First, effective leaders actively develop successors and colleagues rather than protecting their own indispensability. Organizations benefit when authority and responsibility are appropriately distributed rather than concentrated in single positions. Second, secure leadership celebrates others' achievement and empowerment rather than viewing them as threats to personal position. The measure of leadership effectiveness often lies in the success of those being led rather than merely personal accomplishments or recognition. Third, spiritual leadership particularly benefits from multiplication rather than concentration, as divine work exceeds any individual's capacity and requires community effort. The model of shared spiritual authority appears throughout Scripture and continues in contemporary ministry contexts, where teamwork and collaboration produce better results than individual effort. And fourth, mature leaders understand that empowering others creates a legacy and sustainability rather than threatening personal significance. Moses' willingness to share authority enabled Israel's continued leadership development and transition beyond his personal ministry. Gordon Wenham says this in his commentary: Moses' generous response to shared authority demonstrates that secure spiritual leadership celebrates the empowerment of others rather than protecting personal position, understanding that divine work benefits from multiplication of gifted leaders rather than concentration of power in single individuals. So, what complaints are commonly heard in the church? What complaints have you made? Contemporary church complaints often mirror Israel's wilderness grievances, revealing that human nature's tendency toward ingratitude and selective memory transcends historical periods and cultural contexts. These complaints typically reflect deeper spiritual issues rather than merely surface dissatisfaction with church life or Christian experience. Common complaints about spiritual leadership, for example, include things like criticism of pastoral authority or their teaching style or their decision-making processes. Like Israel's challenge to Moses' authority, these complaints often reflect resistance to spiritual accountability rather than legitimate concerns about the quality of leadership. Then there are complaints about worship style. They mirror Israel's dissatisfaction with the monotony of manna. Sometimes you'll have believers express boredom with traditional hymns or upset with contemporary music. They like or they don't like a preaching style or liturgical practices, looking for entertainment value rather than worshipful engagement. The underlying issue involves the fact that people approach church with kind of a consumer mentality that evaluates worship according to personal preference rather than divine honor. Financial complaints represent another common category where believers question expectations that they tithe or contribute to building funds or ministry budgets, and they get concerned about budget priorities. Like Israel's demand for meat, these complaints often reflect material focus rather than spiritual priorities, revealing hearts that evaluate divine blessing primarily through economic rather than spiritual measures. And then there's the issue of service expectations. They create complaints when believers feel overburdened by ministry responsibilities or underappreciated for their contributions. Like Moses' overwhelming leadership burden, these complaints can reflect legitimate need for shared responsibility or unrealistic expectations about recognition and support. In other words, as Dennis Cole says, contemporary church complaints often mirror Israel's wilderness grievances, revealing that spiritual maturity requires learning to distinguish between legitimate concerns deserving attention and rebellious complaints reflecting spiritual immaturity that requires heart examination rather than environmental change. Well, that's our brief look at sharing the burden of leadership in Numbers chapter 11. I hope you'll join us next week as we look at rebellion, trusting God against all odds in Numbers 14. Between now and then, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in Him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.